Hi and welcome back to That Office Guy. My name is Nick and today I'm going to show you my top tips for Microsoft Excel in 2021. If you find this useful and informative, do go ahead and hit that like button for me. And if you're new to the channel, do consider subscribing. By subscribing, you will be kept up to date with all the videos that we do here at That Office Guy. So with all that said, let's jump on over to the desktop and take a look at these top tips from Microsoft Excel. Right, here we are just inside Excel. I'm just going to zoom in for you guys so you get a bit of a clearer picture as to what's going on here. So my first tips for you guys are to talk about V and X lookups, okay? So a lot of people will be familiar with the VLOOKUP function, right? It's very, very simple. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go equals VLOOKUP, right? I'm just going to open that up in the parentheses. Now the lookup value, a table array, a column index, and then the range to look up. So let's have a look, right? So straight away, what value am I looking for? So I'm going to be looking for my name in this scenario here. Okay, I'm going to hit comma, and I'm going to say where am I going to find it? It's going to be inside here. Okay, so the lookup value has to be the very first column. I'm then going to hit comma, and I say, okay, well, what number do I want to return? I want to return the score, so I'm going to go ahead and type the second column, or number 2. And the last part is optional. So, well, say optional, it's the true or false statement. Okay, so by default, most people will want to type in false in this particular scenario, which gives you an exact match. And I'm going to close that off and press return. We can see here that it found my name and returned my score here of number 8. Now, the thing that you've got to bear in mind with a VLOOKUP like this, my name is repeated twice, right? It found the very first match and returned 8. It did not find the second match and return the number 5. Okay, so straight away the VLOOKUP is not necessarily doing what I wanted it to do. If I wanted the latest date and not the oldest date, then actually these date fields would have been something to consider. So that's a VLOOKUP. It's pretty basic. However, we can obviously adapt this and make it more advanced in order to do the exact thing that we're looking for. However, Microsoft have now actually released a new formula called the XLOOKUP, and it handles this a lot more efficiently. So I'm going to come over here and go equals XLOOKUP. Okay, I'm just going to double click on this to load it up. That'll open up the parentheses, and the lookup value, I'm going to go with Nick again, okay? This time the lookup array is the single column in which my name is going to be found. Okay, it's no longer having to select multiple ranges, it's just wherever Nick's going to be found, select that column. And then the return array, what I would like to return is the score, right? So it's what I'm looking for, where I'm going to find it, and then what I want to return when I find it, right? Now that is a basic XLOOKUP, and it returns the same value. It requires less parts and it's very, very easy. If we click back into this formula, however, we can see that we can expand on this a little bit further, and that is by adding the new comma here. It's if not found. So if it's not found, we can then return this as a 0. There is no score. And then we have a hit a comma again. We have a match mode, right? Here we can say we want an exact match, which is the default. An exact match or the next smallest item, an exact match or the next largest item, or we can actually match it by a wild card, right? So I'm going to go with an exact match and keep it pretty simple for you guys, but do worth exploring those options. The last option is the ability to then search the list in a slightly different way, right? So obviously by default it's from first to last or top to bottom. We have the ability here to say from last to first or bottom to top, right? So really interesting that we can do that. So in this example, I'm going to go ahead and type -1, which then basically starts from the bottom of the list and works its way up. If I press return on that, we now end up with a 5, okay? So in this scenario, we have an XLOOKUP that's more advanced than our VLOOKUP, but very, very easy to understand and use. Okay, so we can now go from the bottom to the top or from the top to the bottom. And if we wanted to, we could obviously sort it by a date order. We can do various different things in order to get to this result here. So XLOOKUP, guys, is tip number 1. Definitely worth exploring and utilizing it in 2021. The next thing that we want to look at is the ability to have sums and SUMIFS. Okay, so I'm going to come in here and zoom in a little bit further. So for starters, we obviously have the ability to just sum, right? So I can go ahead and go equals sum. A lot of people will be familiar with the sum ability. We can say, okay, I want Nick here and I want Nick here, right? and just having a comma to separate those. That gets me to a score of 13, right? However, there's better ways and more efficient ways of doing it. Okay, so instead of, doing it like that, or, using, an auto sum ability like this, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and use the SUMIFS. Okay, so I'm going to get equals SUMIFS. Okay, and open up a bracket. This then goes and says, okay, what's the sum range? Well, the sum range is the score. Okay, so the score is what I want. I want the whole column in this scenario. The criteria range is next, and the criteria range is quite simple. It's going to be by my name. Okay, so there's a whole range of names. And then what is the criteria? Well, the criteria is going to be my name. Okay, so it's the range that we're going to summarize, where our criteria is going to be found, and what is the criteria. I can close that off in a bracket and press return, and straight away now I have a formula that I can just pull this down, and it's going to calculate all of the SUMIFS for every single person here, whereas if I were to pull that down, all of those would be incorrect and wrong. So really difficult to figure that out. Okay, so ultimately SUMIFS is really useful. Now if I go ahead here and go equals SUMIF, which is the other way of doing it, this is basically a range, a criteria, and a sum range, right? So it works in the same way, except it's a little bit in reverse, right? This way you only have a single criteria that you could ever use with the formula. And basically the first thing you want to do is select the range where the criteria will be found, the criteria itself, and then the sum range. Okay, so a little bit in a backwards way gets you the same result, but it's a little bit more difficult. Now, for example, here, if I wanted to, I could add a second criteria using SUMIFS, but with SUMIF I couldn't. So I always tend to use SUMIFS rather than SUMIF. I find that this one's going to be limiting me going forward if for any reason I wanted to add a second criteria. So for example, if I wanted to come back in here and say, okay, I only want to summarize ranges within a certain date range, in which case I could go ahead and add a second criteria. The range of that criteria is going to be the date, and the date has to be the 24th, and then press return on there. It's going to then load me up a summarized version of all of my scores on the 24th, okay? So that gets me an 8, which is obviously the single criteria. I can pull that down and it's still going to work. Whereas this one, I'd have to then, potentially do a sum of 2 SUMIFs, and you'd start nesting multiple formulas. It would be a pretty messy formula. So definitely investigate SUMIFs. That's my tip number 2 for 2021. The next thing to look at is basically freezing panes. So if we come over to our View tab, we have multiple options here under freeze panes, right? We have the freeze the top row, freeze the first column, or freeze panes. 3 different ways of freezing things, right? And what that means, if I come in here and go freeze top row, I can scroll down and the top row is always going to be frozen in place, right? So as I scroll down, I can always see what those headers are, which is a really useful feature. I'm going to unfreeze that for a second. If we go ahead and freeze the first column, we get the same scenario, but when we go over to the right hand side here, it was going to freeze column A in place, so we always know what the date is, okay? Really useful. But obviously as we scroll down, we lose those headers. So the next thing we want to be looking at is actually the freeze panes option. Now the freezing panes option allows you to fix both the columns and the headers at the same time, but you have to make sure that your cursor is already in the right place or you have the right cell selected. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on my name here, which is the very first record, okay, if we want to be freezing the date and we want to freeze the name. So what we want to do is make sure that whatever column you want to freeze is immediately to the left of your selection, and the row that you would like to freeze is immediately above the selection of the cell. From here, you can go ahead and click on Freeze Panes, and that will then freeze the headers, and it will also freeze the columns. So that way you can always see everything that you need within that frozen pane. Now if I unfreeze it and were to select over here and then freeze panes, I'm actually freezing everything above my selected cell and everything to the left of my selected cell. So that would be bad. Always make sure that you have the right cell selected, freeze the panes, and then you're good to go. Really useful tip, something that I use regularly, and it really does help organize your data. Make sure you know exactly where you are within your document at any one point. Really useful feature inside Microsoft Excel. So the next one that we're going to talk about, guys, is all about if and ifs. Okay, so ifs is a new function that kind of replaces if. If basically is a well-known function where you go equals if, we open up a bracket and we can test something, right? So we say if this equals, and in quotations, Nick, okay, then I would like to return the score, okay? If it doesn't, then I can put a 0 and close off my if formula, right? So there's my if, and as I pull this down, everything else will be 0 because, you know, B2 does not equal Nick. Now, obviously B8 here does equal Nick, so I get that one pulled in. So it's going to just pull in those two scores, okay, which is really useful. Another way of doing this is just to put double quotation instead of a 0, press return and pull that down. It's going to remove all those zeros and just show us the two scores, right, where my name equals, where the cell equals Nick, right? So really useful function, and it's kind of widely being used by nesting them together, right? So instead of that, we can say, okay, if it equals Nick, bring back Nick's score. But if open up another if, this equals, let's say, Dennis, then I would like to also bring back Dennis's score. If it doesn't, then I'll blank that off and then I'll close my parentheses, right? So you have two nested if formulas running together, and I clearly have not included an equal sign there. We'll do that, right? So now I can copy this down and I get Dennis's scores and Nick's scores coming through. The problem with this is you end up having to nest so many different if functions together to get you that same result. Now, if we go ahead and go equals ifs, on the other hand, we get multiple logical tests, right? So I can go, if this equals, in quotations, Nick, then I want, obviously, to bring back that. Okay, hit a comma, we get a second logical test. We go B2 to equal Chris. Okay, and if it does, then I want that. Okay, and then we can say, okay, if for a third logical test, B2 were to say equal Dennis, and then, you know, we could go ahead and return Dennis's score. Now, obviously, we have a fourth logical test, which is like a capture all, where we just type in the word true, okay, and then we can return a 0, okay, on that. Okay, so I can go ahead and close that off. And the way that this is going to work is basically it runs it in order. So it says, okay, first of all, check if it equals Nick. If it does, bring back Nick's score. If it doesn't, we'll go ahead and check if it equals Chris. If it equals Chris's, we'll bring Chris's score back. And if not, then we'll go check see if it equals Dennis. If it equals Dennis's, we'll bring Dennis's back. If not, then we're going to force it to say it's true and a true value of 0. Okay, so we're going to press enter on that. And I can go ahead and pull that all the way down. And here we can see we get Chris, we get Nick, we get Chris, and we get Dennis's scores all the way through here, and everyone else is a 0. So ifs is a really nice, clean way of adding multiple if statements nested together. It doesn't fully replace the scenario where you might need to use if, but it's a very, very good function that I believe everyone should start playing around with and start using, because it makes things a lot more efficient for Excel, specifically in those larger documents. Moving on to our next tip, which is pivot tables. Pivot tables are a fantastic use inside Microsoft Excel. Now, here I have this little mini data table, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and select it like this, and then I'm going to go ahead, insert pivot table. Okay, and what I've got here is it's then selected the data and it's going to put it into a new worksheet, right, which is not necessarily what I want to do. So I'm going to click cancel. What I'm going to do is I'm going to click over here instead, right, so E1, I'm going to click pivot table. This time I'm then going to have this dialog box appear, and I'm going to select the range that I would like, which is going to be this here. And then I'm going to obviously make sure it's existing workbook in E1, and I'm going to press OK. Now my pivot table appears right next to my source data. From here I can go ahead and just add all the names into the columns and the score into values as a sum of, right? So now I have a summarized value of all of the scores inside that particular table. So anyone who's not really utilizing pivot tables, do recommend using them. They have good use cases. And they're not perfect, you know, they're great, but I prefer to use other formulas to kind of summarize my data up for me. But, you know, it still is good to use a pivot table. With that being said, the other thing that you can do is actually create pivot charts directly from this source data as well. So I can come in here, go insert. This time I'm going to come over to pivot chart over here. I'm going to click pivot chart, have this source data. I'm going to select all of this source data here, click OK, and we end up with the same scenario. It looks like a pivot table, except it's going to draw this pivot chart out for me. So I'm going to put the names into the axes, and I'm going to put the scores into the values, and then we end up with a pivot chart like that. So this is basically keeps it really simple. It basically means you don't have to first of all create a pivot table and then create a pivot chart, or summarize your data before creating the chart. It keeps things pretty slick. So pivot charts are pretty good. Really recommend starting to use those as well if you want to visualize your data inside Excel. So really a useful tip there. And the last thing I want to talk about, guys, is all about Excel tables. Excel tables are fantastic. If you are unfamiliar, Excel tables are great for being inside the Microsoft 365 ecosystem. And what I mean by that is when you put data into an Excel table, you can query it slightly differently, right? So you can actually start to summarize data based on their headers, or pull data into Power Automate because it's inside an Excel table. Lots of really good features that come when you start using Excel tables. So the easiest way I find to actually turn or convert data into a table is to come over to the Home tab here and click on Format as Table. By clicking on the Format as a Table, we can go ahead and just choose a style. Choose whatever style you would like. It will automatically select the data that you have here. If it's not quite right, you can go ahead and edit this range to make sure it encapsulates everything that you need. You'll see ticket, say it has a header, and then click OK. From here, you then have an Excel table, and it's called a table design contextual tab at the top here. And on the left-hand side, you can give it a name. So I'm just going to call this scores. Okay, so this table name is called scores, which is really useful. Every time I click into here, we can see that it's called scores. It takes us over to the table design tab and all that good stuff. You can add additional data just by typing it underneath as well, and it's really useful. Now, I'm going to show you one of the really cool functions once you have it into a table, and that is to go ahead and use sum as an easy example. Right, this time we're going to summarize, and we're going to go ahead and find our scores as a table. Okay, and I'm going to just zoom in here. Let me just get out of this 1 second and just zoom in so you guys can see this a little bit clearer. I'm going to go equals sum, open up this, and I'm going to go ahead and type scores, right? And that gives us this little table icon. And click on that, and it basically highlights all of the data inside our table called scores. Okay, and then I'm going to go ahead and put one of these brackets in, and basically it then shows us the things that we can summarize inside our data table. We're going to go for the score, right? So I'm going to go and put score in there, close that off, and then I can just close the parentheses. And now that's going to summarize everything inside our score table that has a score as a number. I'm going to press return, and you can see it's 79, right? So now our formula actually is really legible. It really does read well. It basically is telling us that we're summarizing our table called scores, and we're summarizing the field called score, which is really useful. But beyond that, we could then use a filter. If we could filter our table and then summarize it as well. So really awesome ways that we can then go ahead and start messing around with our data tables. Now, once you have them in a data table like this, or an Excel table like this, like I said before, there's lots of really cool things that you can do with that data, even outside of Excel. So I personally am using Excel tables more and more as we investigate other more automated ways of working moving forward. So if you've got large data tables that you're currently not, formatting as a table in Excel, I do highly recommend converting them, because you'll be able to, summarize data, filter data, and do a whole host of other things in a really useful way going forward. There's even database specific functions called things like dsum, okay, which basically lets you summarize data inside an Excel table specifically. So really good stuff going forward. And guys, hopefully you found this video useful. And these are my top tips for Microsoft Excel going into 2021, and I do recommend you guys start investigating them, playing around with some of those functions, and I do find them incredibly useful on a day-to-day basis. If you found this useful, do go ahead and hit that like button for me. It really does mean a lot to the channel. And if you haven't yet subscribed, do go ahead and subscribe. By subscribing, you will be kept up to date with all of the videos and hints and tips that we do here at That Office Guy. And with all that said, I hope you have a fantastic day, and we'll catch you all in the next one.